One small act of kindness, and she walked away like it was nothing. She had no idea who she'd just helped. But a few blocks away, someone was still holding onto the receipt.
Find her.
Welcome to Heart and Home, where every story reminds us that kindness, love, and family can change a life forever. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps Heart and Home continue bringing stories that inspire, comfort, and remind us of the goodness that still exists in the world. Now, imagine this. You've just finished a long, exhausting day at work, and there's exactly $18 left in your wallet. $18. That's supposed to buy the medicine your mother desperately needs tonight. Then, standing in front of you at the pharmacy counter, an elderly woman quietly hears the words no one wants to hear. "I'm sorry, your card has been declined." Her prescription costs $17.84. You have just enough money to help her. But if you do, your own mother may have to go without her medication. What would you choose? Emily Carter never imagined that the answer to that one small question would become the first step in changing her entire life. This is the opportunity she never asked for. Some choices are so small, we don't even notice we're making them. Until years later, looking back, we realize that was the moment everything changed. For Emily, it was a Thursday afternoon in Chicago, cold enough to see her breath, with exactly $18 folded in her coat pocket. She had just finished her shift at the grocery store, her hands still raw from the mop bucket and the cardboard boxes. 26 years old, a business degree with honors, an internship at a respected financial firm that had once written her a glowing reference, and a job offer she never signed. She was walking home in the rain instead, counting her last few dollars, because that was simply what her life had become. Her father had died in a workplace accident 3 years earlier. Her mother, Linda, lived with chronic kidney disease and needed her medication refilled every month, without fail. Her younger brother, Ethan, was 2 years into a civil engineering degree and kept threatening, half joking, to drop out and get a job so Emily wouldn't have to carry everything alone. Every time he brought it up, she shut it down. That subject was never open for discussion. She turned into the small pharmacy on the corner, the one she visited every month, and the pharmacist recognized her on site, already reaching for her mother's prescription. That's when she noticed the small commotion at the register in front of her. An older woman, dressed plainly, stood frozen as her card was declined. She tried again, then a third time. Each failed swipe made her face redden, with something worse than frustration, with shame. Behind her, a line was forming. A man near the back side, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "People shouldn't shop if they can't pay," he muttered. Nobody disagreed. The older woman lowered her head and began to step back, leaving her prescription on the counter. The pharmacist read the total, almost to himself. $17.84. Emily looked down at the $18 in her hand, the exact amount she needed for her mother's medicine tonight. If she gave it away, her mother would wait one more day. For a second, she saw her mother by the window, twisting the cap off an almost empty bottle, coughing softly in the dark. And then, just as quickly, she saw the stranger's face. The way it had folded, under the weight of one careless comment. Emily stepped forward and placed her money on the counter before she let herself think twice. "I'll cover the rest," she said. The woman turned, stunned. "Why would you do this?" Emily only smiled. The answer came out simply, as if she'd always known it. Because illness shouldn't become humiliation. The woman studied her for a long moment, the way people look at something they intend to remember. She asked for Emily's name. Emily just shook her head, said it wasn't necessary, and walked out, without a bag of medicine in her hands. It had started to rain. She opened her umbrella, an old one, faded blue, the ribs slightly bent from years of Chicago winters, and walked the rest of the way home under it. That night, when her mother asked about the medicine, Emily lied without much conviction. They were out of your dosage. I'll go back tomorrow. Linda didn't push. She only looked at her daughter, a beat too long, and let it go. Never let hardship decide who you become. It was something her mother used to say, long before any of this. And it was the thought Emily carried up the stairs to bed that night. She had no idea that a few blocks away, in a parked car outside the pharmacy, the older woman was still sitting there, the receipt in her hand. Her name was Margaret Hartwell, founder and chairwoman of Evercrest Development Group, one of the most respected affordable housing companies in Chicago. Find her, Margaret said to the man in the driver's seat. Calm, the way she always sounded, once her mind was made up. It didn't take Marcus long. Store cameras. A few careful questions to the pharmacist. Within 2 days, he had a name and a story. What he brought back to Margaret's desk made her sit still for a long time. A degree with a strong record, an internship with a glowing evaluation, and an unclaimed job offer. And underneath it all, the plain facts of a life. A father's death, a mother's illness, a brother still in school, and a daughter who had quietly folded her own future to keep the rest of her family standing. Margaret closed the file, but didn't send it away just yet. She sat with it a while longer, turning one thought over in her mind, one she didn't share with Marcus that night. Am I choosing her because of who she is, or because of how she made me feel, standing at that register? She thought of every executive she'd ever hired on paper alone, and how many of them had disappointed her anyway. Then she thought of the way this young woman hadn't hesitated, hadn't performed kindness for an audience, hadn't even wanted her name known. She didn't become the kind of person who pays a stranger's bill because I happened to be standing there, Margaret finally said. She was already that person. I just happened to see it. It wasn't proof. It was judgment. And judgment, she reminded herself, was the only thing 30 years of running this company had ever really taught her to trust. A letter arrived at Emily's apartment days later, inviting her to Evercrest's downtown office. She read it 3 times, certain it was a scam. No company hired a grocery store janitor into a research position over one chance encounter at a pharmacy. But when she called the number at the bottom, a real person answered, and everything checked out. She walked into the glass tower in her only decent coat, feeling every inch of the distance between herself and the people moving briskly through the lobby. When the office door opened, and she saw the woman behind the desk, she froze. It was her, the woman from the pharmacy. I'm not hiring you for what you did, Margaret said, without preamble. I'm hiring you for who your record shows you've always been. What you did at that register just made me notice sooner. The contract on the desk was for 90 days. A temporary position, community research assistant. No guarantees. If it didn't work out, it would simply end. Emily signed her name, her hand not quite steady. Her first day was a small, steady series of embarrassments. She didn't know the dress code. She stared blankly at the espresso machine in the break room, until a passing research analyst named Jason took pity on her and showed her which button did what. First week's always the worst, he said, handing her the cup. You'll survive it. She wandered into the wrong conference room twice. Someone snickered at her title, research assistant, like the words belonged in air quotes. Adrian Reed, the company's senior vice president and its presumed heir apparent after 14 years of service, was polite to her in a way that felt colder than open hostility. He didn't say anything unkind. He simply made it clear, in every small interaction, that she didn't belong yet. Only Samuel Hayes, the longtime chief financial officer, watched her without judgment. No encouragement. No criticism either. Just watching, the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet. That night, back in her apartment, Emily made herself a quiet promise. I will not waste this. She did not yet know that on that very first day, she had already made the mistake that would define the next several months of her life. The mistake of believing that doing everything herself was the same thing as doing it well. The weeks that followed blurred into one exhausting rhythm. She read late into the night, underlining words she didn't understand instead of asking anyone, because admitting she didn't know felt like proof she didn't belong. Days at Evercrest. Weekend shifts at the coffee shop. nights caring for her mother. Sleep became something she rationed. Jason became the one person who made the office feel survivable. He left a spare umbrella on her desk one rainy afternoon without comment. He covered for her once, when she was late after a hospital visit with her mother, telling their supervisor she'd been out on field work. Small things. The kind that add up to a person actually being on your side. While reviewing files for a redevelopment project, Emily found something buried in the numbers nobody else was talking about. More than 500 families living in the project's footprint would be displaced, and the reports barely mentioned them. She brought it to Adrian, who ran the project. He listened, nodded politely, and told her relocation had already been accounted for. She pushed back once more, carefully, in a later meeting. It was enough. She was pulled off the project by the end of the day. That night, Emily sat in her kitchen with a resignation letter half-written in her head. She had believed, foolishly, that someone like her could change anything in a place like this. Linda sat down across from her and offered only the sentence Emily had heard her whole life. Never let hardship decide who you become. It landed differently this time. Emily wasn't quitting because there was no path forward. She was quitting because she was afraid. She decided, instead, to get proof they couldn't ignore. She started knocking on doors, on her own time, in the neighborhood slated for redevelopment. The first Saturday, 11 homes. 9 didn't answer. 2 told her to leave. She kept going. 30 households, over the following weekends. 29 turned her away. You people only show up here when you want something, one man told her, and shut the door. A teenager threw a soda can at her feet on Halstead Street. At one apartment, a father simply stood with his arms crossed, said nothing, and waited for her to leave, which, eventually, she did. Somewhere around the 20th closed door, she stopped taking it personally and started writing down the pattern instead. The same word, in different voices. Promised. Everyone here had been promised something, once, and watched it disappear. It was the 30th house, at the end of a Saturday she'd nearly given up on, where a woman named Delia Reyes looked at her, soaked, exhausted, still standing, and said only, "You're still here. Come in, then." That conversation cracked something open. Delia told her about a broken promise from a decade ago. She introduced Emily to 2 of her neighbors. By month's end, Emily had documented stories no spreadsheet at Evercrest had ever captured. She brought the beginnings of it to Samuel, expecting guidance. Instead, he looked at her folder of notes and asked, "What do the numbers tell you?" "That we can't displace these people," Emily said. "That's not what I asked." She reworked it 3 times before she understood. A feeling, however true, wasn't a case. When she came back with figures instead of impressions, he asked a second question. "What haven't you asked yet?" It took another week to realize she hadn't asked what it would cost the company to keep these families in place. She'd been so focused on the human cost of removing them, she'd left out the one number that would make anyone with a spreadsheet actually listen. She built the analysis alone, late at night, refusing help from Jason when he offered, refusing Samuel's suggestion to bring in someone from the data team. 2 days before the internal review, she found a formatting error buried deep in her projections, one that would have undercut every number in the report. She caught it at 2 in the morning, hands shaking, and finally called Samuel. He came in early, looked over her spreadsheet without a word of reproach, and helped her fix it within the hour. Only then did he speak. "You don't prove your strength by carrying everything alone," he told her. "You prove it by knowing when not to." She just nodded. It wasn't advice. It was the truth about her, the same flaw her mother had gently pointed at for years, without ever using the word. The finished report showed Evercrest could keep all 500 families in place for a reduction of just 3% in projected profit. Margaret read it in silence, then said simply, "Bring this to the board." Before that meeting, Olivia Hartwell, Margaret's daughter and the company's chief operating officer, drove to the neighborhood alone, unannounced, without telling Emily or anyone else. She had built her career on the belief that leadership meant efficiency, clean numbers, no room for sentiment, and she wanted to see the block for herself, without a report shaping what she noticed first. She parked across from a corner building, and sat there for nearly 20 minutes. Watched a woman carry groceries up 3 flights because the elevator had been broken for months. Watched 2 kids doing homework on a stoop because their apartment had no working lights that evening. She didn't get out of the car. She didn't need to. She drove back to the office and said nothing about the trip to anyone. But the next morning, she read Emily's report again, more slowly this time. "You didn't just find a way to keep the numbers acceptable," she told Emily. "You found people we would have erased and made them impossible to ignore." It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was the first real crack in a belief she'd carried since business school, that a good leader was simply the one who made the cleanest decision, fastest. The night before the report went to investors, Emily opened the shared file to check the final figures and found several relocation costs quietly removed, the very numbers that made the 3% trade-off honest instead of misleading. She understood, almost immediately, who could have done it and why. Adrian had given 14 years, and most of a marriage, to reach the edge of the company's top seat. Weeks earlier, alone in his car outside his ex-wife's house, he'd listened to a voicemail from his daughter. "Happy birthday, Dad. I made you a card, but you weren't here again." He'd sat in the dark a long time before driving away. He told himself, more than once, that if Emily succeeded on a story this simple, everything he'd sacrificed to get here would mean nothing. Fear, dressed up as ambition. By the time he deleted 3 lines of numbers, he'd already convinced himself it was survival. Emily stood in the office that night, holding 2 choices. Let the doctored numbers stand, protect her position, or tell the truth and risk everything she'd built. She chose the truth. The next morning, in front of the investors, she calmly restored the missing figures, explained what had changed, and made no accusations. She simply laid the facts on the table. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the oldest investors, a man who'd backed Evercrest since its earliest years, said quietly, "We invest in people we can trust." Adrian said nothing. 2 days later, he asked to speak with Emily privately. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for understanding. He told her plainly that fear had made the decision for him, that it was wrong, and that he was sorry. Then he resigned, on his own terms, before anyone asked him to. 2 years later, Emily stood in a half-finished building on the same block she'd once been chased away from, holding the keys to a project that carried her name for the first time. Delia Reyes stood beside her, watching steel beams move into place. Jason, promoted alongside her by then, called out from across the site that the permits had finally cleared, and for a moment, it felt less like a job and more like people who'd earned something together. Margaret offered Emily the title of director not long after. Emily turned it down. "Not yet," she told Margaret. "I don't want the title before I've earned the judgment that should come with it." Margaret only smiled, the smile of someone watching their instincts confirmed. Emily accepted the promotion a year later, when she was ready to mean it. For years after the day she first walked into Evercrest's lobby in the wrong coat, Emily sat in the audience at a graduation ceremony and watched her brother cross the stage, a civil engineering degree in his hand. Ethan found her in the crowd afterward and wrapped his arms around her without a word, because neither of them needed to say what it had taken to get here. Within the year, he joined Evercrest's infrastructure team, earning his place entirely on his own, refusing every easier entry his sister's name might have bought him. He worked on the very neighborhood she'd once knocked on 30 doors for, helping design the buildings that replaced the ones that had almost disappeared. Some Saturdays, without being asked, he mentored first-generation engineering students at his old university, the same way no one had ever had to ask his sister to keep knocking. 7 years after the pharmacy, Margaret Hartwell announced her retirement. Olivia was named chairwoman. In her first address to the company, she told the room she'd spent most of her career believing leadership was about efficiency. "I've come to understand," she said. "It's about responsibility, about who you're willing to be accountable for." The board met behind closed doors that afternoon. When they opened, Samuel was the one who told Emily the outcome, in his usual short sentences. "They chose you, not because of a pharmacy, because of everything after it." That night, alone in her apartment, Emily thought of her mother's words one final time. Never let hardship decide who you become. The fourth time in her life that sentence had returned to her, and this time, it didn't feel like comfort or challenge. It simply felt true. On the afternoon her appointment as chief executive was made official, Emily skipped the small celebration waiting at the office. She walked instead, the way she used to when she couldn't afford anything but her own 2 feet, until she reached a corner she hadn't stood on in 7 years. The pharmacy looked almost the same. Inside, a girl who couldn't have been older than 19 stood at the counter, her face down, quietly explaining she could only afford part of her father's prescription. Emily stepped forward and tapped her card against the reader before the girl could finish the sentence. No cash counted out this time. No hesitation. Just a soft beep, and it was done. The girl turned, startled. "I'll pay you back," she said quickly. "I promise, I just need a little time." "No," Emily said gently. The girl blinked, confused. "But promise me something instead." Emily reached into her bag, passed the card that read Chief Executive Officer, Evercrest Development Group, and pulled out a different one. For a scholarship and career program run by the Evercrest Foundation for young people forced to put their futures on hold because life had asked too much of them, too soon. When someone needs you the way you needed someone today, Emily said, do the same for them. The girl looked down at the card, then back up. "How will I remember to?" Emily smiled, already stepping toward the door. "Don't remember me," she said. "Remember this moment." Outside, it had started to rain, the same soft, ordinary rain that had followed her home 7 years earlier. She opened her umbrella, the same faded blue one, ribs bent in the same places, and stood a moment under the awning, watching the street fill with the quiet sound of rain on pavement. She thought, briefly, of a version of herself from 7 years ago, walking this same stretch of sidewalk, empty-handed, a lie already forming for her mother. That girl hadn't known anything about boardrooms or balance sheets. She'd only known that a stranger's shame, at a register, mattered more than medicine that could wait one more day. Nothing tonight required that kind of sacrifice. That, Emily understood now, was the whole point. The opportunity had never been the reward. It had only ever been the door. What she did with everything on the other side of it, that had been up to her every single day since. She stepped out from under the awning and walked into the wet evening street. Same umbrella, same rain. No one behind her tonight, left to lie to. She had opened the first door without knowing where it would lead. She spent the rest of her life making sure the ones behind her stayed open too. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If Emily's journey reminded you that true character is revealed by the choices we make when no one is watching, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Heart and Home so you never miss another inspiring journey. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people you love.